How are you,
And
Melanie? You
oh, look
okay?
at that. We're so keen to talk. We're talking at the same time.
We are, we are. Do you want me to shut up? I'll shut up. You carry on.
No, don't shut up because this is a really meaty passage. We both
And
need to be really digging into this, don't we, tonight?
so what you're going to tell us about it then? Because isn't it just basic repetition? Isn't Jesus just, if you like, expanding on what's coming 49 and 50, responding to their questions and just expanding on really what he's already said?
Well, there is repetition, isn't there? But I mean, and we've got the repetition of that key phrase that we were thinking about last time. I will raise them up at the last day. So there's the fourth mention of raising up is in verse 54. And we've
Hmm.
also got themes, you know, um, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood, you've got that sort of welcome
Yeah.
to anyone. So we've got some of the common themes. We've got the common theme, sort of tops and tails this bit almost, if you add it into the last passage about your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever.
Yeah.
Um, so we've got that, but I think we've got some additional bits in there as well, haven't
Well,
we?
before you go on, Melanie, to the additional bits, there's also which I think is quite a key to understanding the whole of John 6, which again we touched on last time, the future tense of verse 51, which I will give for the whole world. So again, that repetition of
Or on
Jesus.
behalf of, because there's that idea of that substitutionary idea in there, isn't there?
Yep. But the voluntary sacrificial nature of Jesus going to the cross is repeated as well.
And that theme of the Passover lamb, because that's where we get the sort of the Passover lamb idea, isn't it? The
Mm,
Passover lamb that gave its life
yeah,
so that the Israelite firstborn could live.
yeah.
And that's really, really crucial, isn't it, to understanding what's going on in these verses. If we were to skip all the Passover themes and ignore them, um,
There'd be nothing
we could
left.
well we would draw different conclusions to what the passage is about, ones that weren't necessarily
Hmm.
Jesus's intention, wouldn't we?
Yeah, yeah. So what's going to be your main point?
I think the main point, the big picture of these few verses, but also all of it really, is what we need as human beings is we need life, but not just life now, because that's
Hmm.
where so many people settle, isn't it? We want to live now, live your best life. That's a common phrase, isn't it? We strive to treatment after treatment if we've got a terminal diagnosis, often because we want to cling on to the life that we've got.
Hmm.
But actually, Jesus offers so much more than just your best life now. He does offer your best life now, but he also offers eternal life and that we'll be raised up with him in heaven. Um, and then the additional thing that we get in this passage, which is in verse 56, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I
Hmm.
in them. So he offers this intimate relationship with him and through him with the Father. So
Yeah.
I think that's going to be my main point
Okay.
is
And
is
what?
how do we have life? We have it through our believing in Jesus. And what's this life like? Well, it's a life that's lived with Jesus now and right into eternity.
What do you think the Jews are arguing about?
Oh, well, how can this man give us his flesh to eat?
Yeah.
Well, I think it sounds on the surface that they're worried about cannibalism, which of course would be disgusting, wouldn't it? If somebody come up to us and said, "Oh, you know what? You've got to eat my flesh to live," you'd be like, "Oh, go away, you're a weirdo." So I don't think it's particularly that. There might be an element of it. I think it's this Paschal lamb. I think they've got this Paschal lamb idea because, of course, the lamb had two functions, didn't it? They ate the body of the lamb at the Passover meal, but they had to consume all of it, didn't they? and the blood was used on the doorposts.
Hmm.
So I think it's got something to do with that. What do you think?
What do I think about what the
What
Jews are
they're so
arguing about?
what they're so upset about? Yeah.
Well, it's claimed to be divinity, isn't it? And coming down from heaven, I am the bread, living bread that came down from heaven, that they're responding to, and that this bread will give life for the world. Um,
But that's what they're upset about in the first bit. That was what we looked at last time. And
that's what
one
they're
assumes
upset
they're
about
still
here.
up. Yeah, well, one assumes they're still upset about that. But there's an extra thing on here because Jesus has added this extra element, hasn't he? About eating, the bread is my flesh, and whoever eats this bread will live forever. He's added that
Yeah.
from where they were earlier on in the passage, hasn't he?
So you would take that looking back to Passover rather than looking forward to the cross.
Well, I think it's both, isn't it? I think it's absolutely both because he replaces the Passover lamb, doesn't he? In the fact that he gives his life, but he hasn't
Mhm.
specified crucifixion. So we can see it looking back down, can't we? But
Mhm.
I don't think they would have got crucifixion out of it simply because for the Messiah to be nailed, to hung on a tree, as it were, is, you know, is outside of their frame of reference, isn't it? Because when Jesus told the disciples what was going to happen to him, most of the time they just ignored it, didn't they? They just went on to the next thing because it was so outside their frame of reference. And
Mhm.
Peter tells Jesus that no, 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 that's not going to happen. So,
Mhm.
so I think for them to get that it's going to be the crucifixion is a bit of a step too far. But the fact that he thinks he can in some way replace the Passover lamb, I think is would be offensive to them, don't you?
Yeah, but it's also the claim of divinity of coming down from heaven that is highly offensive to them.
Oh yeah, of course. But in verse 52, they don't mention that, do they? They're mentioning about eating the flesh.
Yeah, well, it's Jesus has just said it in verse 51. And then verse 52, they've heard Jesus say that and they respond to it and say, well,
Yeah.
how can
I
this
suppose
man
they
give
say,
us
how can
flesh
this
to eat?
man, which would go along with your kind of argument. But we should talk about the elephant in the room, shouldn't we?
And what's that, Melanie?
Is this about communion?
And
Is it about the Eucharist? Is,
is it?
what do you think?
I asked you first.
Well, do you know what? I I've been being a little bit lazy over these weeks. You know what? I didn't quite get
Never.
so far as to get my Carson out, right? Okay,
Oh,
because I'm going to say something now, which will cause shock and horror to go to the heart of every conservative evangelical, and that
right.
is, I find Carson really hard work.
All right. Good.
I know he's really sound and all of that, but I do find him really hard work. But I got him out on this one
Yeah.
because he's got a lot. He looks at it in depth.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got a cast and you want to look at the arguments in depth, then I would definitely pull it out because he's got lots of good things to say. And one of the things he does say is he comes to the conclusion that no, Jesus isn't instituting the Eucharist at this point, and he's not making reference to it. And we'll come on to some of the arguments maybe, because JC Ryle also put some arguments in. I love me JC Ryle. But he says such allusions as exist to communion prompt the thoughtful reader to look behind the Eucharist to which the Eucharist itself points.
Mm-hmm.
So
Which is,
he's saying, yeah, he's saying actually, it's when we receive the bread and wine on a Sunday or whenever, we're to make sure it points us back to the cross,
mm-hmm.
Jesus's body and blood given for us, rather than as a thing in itself. I think that's what he's saying.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think, I mean, there are several things, some major, some minor. You talk, I think we talked about 2 weeks ago about John 6 needs to be placed within the context of John's gospel. And what's John's gospel? It's an evangelistic tract. And if this is talking about the Eucharist, well, if it's been used in an evangelistic sense, how are people going to understand that? Um,
And actually, on that point, I've got another quote. Told you I'm full of quotes today. Augustine, right? You've probably never heard me quote Augustine before. Probably never will again. But he said, "Believe, and you have eaten."
yes. But doesn't Carson quote Augustine?
Well, that's where I got it from. I don't think I actually read Augustine, do you?
Ah, you let us down now.
Oh, come on. I was trying to sound clever then. But it is a good quote, though, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why Carson uses it.
Yeah, well, he's dead brainy, isn't he? And I'm not. But but he makes that important point that you're on about, isn't it? That it's believing that's the important thing.
Yeah, that's
Believing
right.
in Jesus. And actually, JC Ryle says he goes through some of the objections to Jesus instituting the Eucharist here or
Yeah.
referring to the Eucharist here. And his biggest one, and this is the one that's most compelling to me, is actually it would cut from life those who aren't able to receive communion, because he says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, what about the penitent thief on the cross? What about babies? What about really, genuine Christians who are like in the Salvation Army or something, where they don't have the Eucharist?
Mm-hmm.
Are they condemned to have no life? It doesn't seem to logically hold up to me, you
Mm-hmm.
know, with all the other things we know about what Jesus says.
I think also another point that Carson makes in the section you're quoting from is the use of the language as well, and the contrast with Mark. So in Mark, Mark says, "This is my body," and as Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, Jesus uses the term body, whereas here John is talking about flesh. And you think back to the prologue, the word
It
became
became
flesh.
flesh.
Yeah, the way to life. Yeah,
So actually, I did a fair bit of reading for this. Did you guess? William
right.
Temple, right? Here's another quote. Well, I'm not actually going to quote him, but he says he sees that the flesh and blood, the two being linked together, um, is an indication of sort of death and life. He says the flesh represents death, and of course the blood represents life. That's why the Israelites are not allowed to have blood in their
Mhm.
meat, because it represents life. Deuteronomy 12:23. Um, and so in linking the flesh and the blood, he's saying it's from death to life because of Jesus who died and lived.
Mhm.
I thought it was quite interesting.
So while you're in a brainy mood,
Oh, not really, but go on.
what do you make of Carson's use of Bultmann?
Oh, I don't think I read that far. What did he say? Go on,
Okay.
you fill us in then. You be the brainy one.
No, no, I have questions, so I was wondering what you made of it, but never
Well,
mind.
you brought up Bultmann, which takes me right back to my theology degree here in Lampeter.
Well, you're,
Bultmann said, blah, blah, blah. So go on, what did he
well,
say
you're,
about
you're
Bultmann?
quoting Carson and Ryle and Augustine and all these brainy people. I thought you might have
Stop
had a look at
deflecting.
Bultmann.
Stop
Sorry.
deflecting. Stop deflecting. You brought him up. Go on, what does he say?
Well, I thought you were going to tell us. So I didn't bother. I thought, oh bloody hell, Boltman. Who wants to read Boltman?
You didn't read it
No, of course I didn't, because I thought you're dead, Brady. You'll know what it's
either.
all about.
Well, there we are. Those who are listening, you can go and look it up in your Carson as to what he says about Bultmann. But I think I'd read enough by that point.
Yes.
Because I'm convinced, because of the context and because of some of the problems that there are if you do interpret it as Jesus instituting the Eucharist, the main one being that those who can't receive the bread and wine are denied life. And that
Hmm.
doesn't seem to fit with the believe in me kind of thing.
Hmm.
Whoever, what was, which verse was it? Verse 47. Very truly, I tell you, the one who believes has eternal life. So I think it would contradict that, wouldn't it? I think it opens the door to superstition. Um, and Jesus doesn't explicitly say that it's necessary. And I think if it was something that was that crucial, that if you didn't have it, you would die, I think he'd make it clearer.
Hmm.
So that doesn't seem to fit. Um, but I think it does. I think when he did institute it, he's pointing back to these words rather than these words pointing forward to it.
Yeah.
Because I have got a quote from J.C. Ryle. Listen to this. Where is it?
Go on
Let me
then.
get
Read us
one.
J.C. Ryle.
Oh, I will. I've got
I
to
thought
find
we
the right
might.
one. Um, you say something wise while I find the right one.
Well, how many have you got?
Oh gosh, I've got loads. Oh, here we are. I found it. We may eat the Lord's Supper and yet not eat and drink Christ's body and blood. We
Hmm.
may eat and drink Christ's body and blood, yet not eat the Lord's Supper.
Hmm. Very good.
There you are. Have a little chew on that one.
We will. Well, thank you, Melanie, for your wisdom.
There's one other thing.
Go on, Muff. Go on.
Did you spot the sort of connection to John 15? Which
Good.
interestingly, well, that bit about abiding in me.
Oh, yeah. Remain, abide. Yeah.
Yeah, it's remain in me. Yeah, John 15, isn't it? I am the true vine.
Hmm.
I like that is part of the Last Supper
It,
discourse, which does actually connect the two via the Eucharist a little bit, doesn't it?
what is also interesting, if you were to go a lot deeper, the whole of John 6 picks up all the other I am sayings as well. So at various points you get about the washing and the cleansing, etc., etc. I am the true vine, I am the gate, all pop up as well in John 6 if you look closely enough. It's kind
Oh,
of
well, there we
interesting.
are. There's a little homework for everybody listening. You could go and find all those references.
Now, I think Melanie will for next week.
You'll be hoping.
Or the other task Melanie could do is tell us how, in the final section of John 6, Jesus pulls together all the arguments that he's been using and they appear in one verse.
Oh, well, we'll wait for your wisdom on that. Not sure I'll
Okay.
be brainy enough.
Okay. Have a good night.
Well, plenty to be thinking about. I'll be interested to know how people get on with their sermons on this one. I'm not
But
actually preaching on it because I'll be on holiday. Woo!
where will you be?
Oh, probably nowhere exciting. Probably exploring the area here with my grandson.
Ah, that'd be nice. Well, enjoy yourself.
Yes, and you.
Bye.